This is about sleep architecture, and it explains the reason you keep waking up at 3 in the morning, in a way that has almost nothing to do with stress, bad habits, or getting older in the way you think. What is actually happening inside your brain and body at that hour traces back decades before you ever noticed the problem, and understanding it could reshape the way you think about senior sleep for the rest of your life. Between 23 and 34% of adults over 65 report insomnia symptoms, and more than half flag at least one serious sleep complaint. If you are over 60 and you find yourself staring at the ceiling somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, you belong to a very large group. The real explanation is not about aging in some vague or inevitable way. A specific structural shift in the way your brain builds a night of sleep drives the whole pattern, and that shift locked into place long before your 60th birthday. Scientists call it sleep architecture, and once you understand how it works, the 3 a.m. wake-up stops feeling mysterious. Let us start with how a normal night of sleep is organized. Sleep is not one uniform state your brain drops into and holds for 8 hours. It cycles through 4 distinct stages in roughly 90-minute rotations, completing 4 to 6 full cycles before morning. The first stage, N1, lasts only a few minutes and accounts for about 2 to 5% of total sleep, serving as the transition zone between wakefulness and true sleep. N2 occupies the largest share of the night, somewhere between 45 and 55%, and during this stage the brain fires distinctive electrical patterns called sleep spindles and K-complexes that lock in memories and help keep you asleep. N3, commonly known as deep sleep or slow-wave sleep, is the most restorative phase, defined by large, slow delta waves. Young adults spend roughly 15 to 25% of the night in this stage, and it is when growth hormone floods the body, physical repair accelerates, and the brain consolidates the kind of memory that lets you recall facts and events. REM sleep fills the remaining 20 to 25%, and during REM, the brain runs almost as electrically active as it does during full wakefulness, producing vivid dreams while processing emotions and procedural memory. Here is the detail that changes everything about the 3 a.m. question. Deep slow-wave sleep packs into the first third of the night, while REM episodes stretch longer and longer toward morning, becoming most prominent in the final third. That means the early hours of your sleep sit on a foundation of deep, hard-to-disrupt slow-wave activity, and the late hours, the ones between 2 and 5 in the morning, run on light, fragile, REM-rich sleep that almost anything can break. A full bladder, a snore from your partner, a creak in the hallway, any of these small disruptions pass unnoticed at midnight, but jolt you awake at 3:30 because the architecture underneath you has changed. And that change begins far earlier than most people expect. A landmark study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Dr. Eve Van Cauter and colleagues tracked how deep sleep erodes across the lifespan in healthy men. Slow-wave sleep dropped from about 19% of total sleep at ages 16 through 25, down to just 3.4% by ages 36 through 50. That is the sharpest decline, and it was already complete by middle age, not during the senior years. Doctors Bryce Mander, Joseph Weiner, and Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley cataloged 9 specific changes that appear in sleep from the 5th decade onward in a comprehensive review published in the journal Neuron in 2017. Walker also explored these mechanisms at length in his book Why We Sleep, which brought this research to a broad public audience. Sleep timing drifts earlier. It takes longer to fall asleep. Total sleep time shrinks, fragmentation increases, and the brain shifts more of its time into light stages 1 and 2 at the expense of deep stage 3. Slow wave activity measured over the prefrontal cortex drops by 75 to 80% in older adults compared to young adults. Sleep spindles, those protective electrical bursts in stage 2 that help maintain sleep, fall by up to 50% in the night's final cycles, which are exactly the cycles running between 2 and 5 in the morning. The gold standard normative reference comes from Dr. Maurice O'Hayon, who published a meta-analysis of 65 studies in the journal Sleep in 2004, drawing on data from over 3,500 healthy individuals aged 5 to 102. For each decade of adulthood, total sleep time fell by about 10 minutes. Sleep efficiency dropped by roughly 3% starting from age 40, and wake time after initially falling asleep climbed about 10 minutes per decade between ages 30 and 60. One finding in that data deserves special emphasis. In healthy adults, most sleep variables actually stabilize after age 60, and the single exception is sleep efficiency, which keeps declining. The dramatic architectural changes, the deep sleep loss, the growing fragmentation, are largely locked in by the early 60s. What continues after that is increasing fragility. Older adults wake an average of 3 or 4 times per night according to the National Library of Medicine. About 25% of adults aged 75 to 84 nap during the day, and 1 in 4 older adults reports daytime sleepiness severe enough to interfere with plans. The 3 a.m. awakening is not the start of a new problem. It is the visible surface of an architectural shift that has been building for decades, and by the time most seniors notice it, the deep, slow-wave sleep that once held the late-night hours together is largely already gone. Understanding the architecture explains the fragility, but a separate set of mechanisms explains why the body is primed to wake at that specific hour. No single study pins 3 in the morning as a universal biological alarm clock, but several forces converge to create a window of peak vulnerability in the 2 to 4 a.m. range for older adults. The first is called circadian phase advance. Your body runs on an internal clock governed by a tiny cluster of neurons in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. And in younger adults, this clock typically triggers sleepiness around 10 or 11 at night and wakefulness around 6 or 7 in the morning. Each person's natural timing preference, sometimes called their chronotype, tends to shift earlier with age, so the evening owl of your 30s gradually becomes the early riser of your 60s. Aging shifts the entire rhythm earlier by 1 to 2 hours on average. Dr. Charles Czeisler at Harvard published a study in The Lancet in 1992, showing that the core body temperature nadir, the lowest point in the body temperature cycle and a natural wake trigger, arrives 1 hour and 52 minutes earlier in adults aged 65 to 85 compared to young men aged 18 to 31. The amplitude of that temperature rhythm was also blunted by approximately 40%. When that temperature minimum moves from roughly 5 in the morning to around 3:30 or 4:30, the body's predisposition to wake moves with it. The suprachiasmatic nucleus itself breaks down over time. Hoffman and Schwab published research in Brain Research in 1994 showing that vasopressin-producing neurons in the SCN, the cells that drive the day-night rhythm, lose their oscillation pattern in adults over 50. Alzheimer's disease accelerates the damage, with losses reaching 75% of these cells. Post-mortem studies of human prefrontal cortex tissue published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016 found that clock gene rhythms flatten and shift 4 to 6 hours earlier in adults over 60 compared to those under 40. Cortisol adds another layer to this picture. The stress hormone doubles as the body's natural alarm signal, rising 38 to 75% in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking, a phenomenon called the cortisol awakening response. A forced desynchrony study published in Frontiers in Neuroscience in 2022 placed the circadian peak of this cortisol rhythm at a clock-equivalent time of approximately 3:40 to 3:45 in the morning. That is the closest scientific anchor to the popular 3 a.m. framing. Aging pushes the entire cortisol rhythm earlier and lifts nighttime cortisol levels higher, which means the body's internal alarm arrives ahead of schedule and rings louder. Melatonin plays a role too, though the science here carries a real dispute. The pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain, is responsible for producing melatonin in response to darkness, and it is the gradual calcification of the pineal gland with age that is often cited as the reason melatonin output declines. The conventional view holds that melatonin production declines substantially with age, and one study measured salivary melatonin amplitude in middle-aged subjects at roughly 60% of what young adults produce. A rigorously controlled study by Zeitzer and colleagues published in the American Journal of Medicine in 1999 tells a different story, finding no measurable difference in 24-hour mean or peak melatonin in healthy, drug-free older adults compared to young men. That result suggests much of the population-level decline reflects medications and health conditions rather than aging alone. Melatonin does fall in many older adults, but the drop is neither as universal nor as steep as popular media tends to claim. And then there is the single biggest mechanical contributor to nighttime waking, and it sits not in the brain but in the bladder. Nocturia, the medical term for waking at night to urinate, is staggeringly common. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Data spanning 2005 through 2016 puts the numbers at 83% of men and 85% of women aged 60 and older waking at least once per night to void. Among Medicare beneficiaries over 65 in one study, 63% of men and 54% of women reported 2 or more voids per night, And a Finnish study calculated that men aged 70 to 79 carried 155 times the odds of nocturia compared to men under 30. Sleep apnea compounds the problem on a massive scale and remains dramatically underdiagnosed. Prevalence estimates for obstructive sleep apnea in adults over 65 range from 13 to 32% by standard criteria and climb as high as 70% of older men and 56% of older women using more sensitive measures. 56% of adults over 65 registered as high risk for sleep apnea in a 2018 analysis published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, but only 8% had ever undergone testing with polysomnography, the gold standard overnight sleep study that monitors brain waves, oxygen levels, and breathing simultaneously. Medications round out the picture in ways many seniors never connect to their sleep. Beta blockers, especially lipophilic ones like metoprolol and propranolol, suppress endogenous melatonin and disrupt REM sleep. Late-day diuretics force nighttime urination. Corticosteroids mimic the cortisol awakening signal, and SSRIs, decongestants, and cholinesterase inhibitors used for dementia all activate the nervous system after dark. The 3 a.m. awakening is not random or accidental. Phase advanced circadian biology, diminished deep sleep, an earlier cortisol surge, and a cluster of physical triggers all converge on the most architecturally fragile hours of the night. You might be wondering whether any of this matters beyond the annoyance of lying awake when you would rather be sleeping. It matters a great deal. Dr. Macon Nedergaard's laboratory at the University of Rochester published a landmark study in Science in 2013 showing that sleep roughly doubles the brain's clearance of amyloid beta, the protein that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease, through a drainage network called the glymphatic system. Mander and colleagues demonstrated in a 2015 Nature Neuroscience study of 26 older adults that beta amyloid disrupts the very slow waves of deep sleep responsible for clearing it, feeding a potential vicious cycle. Research from the Walker Laboratory published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2019 tracked how declining sleep quality in the 40s and 50s predicted later beta amyloid buildup, while declining sleep in the 50s and 60s correlated with tau tangles, the other hallmark protein of Alzheimer's. Dr. Christine Yaffe at UCSF showed in a 2011 JAMA study that older women with sleep-disordered breathing carried approximately 1.85 times the odds of developing mild cognitive impairment or dementia within 5 years. The glymphatic clearance model stands as the leading scientific framework, but it is under active debate. A 2024 study using different measurement methods challenged the magnitude of sleep-driven clearance, and this remains a live controversy in the field. The relationship between sleep and Alzheimer's risk is well supported by evidence, but researchers are still refining the precise mechanism. Cardiovascular consequences run equally serious. The American Heart Association's 2021 scientific statement reported that obstructive sleep apnea prevalence reaches 40 to 80% in patients with hypertension, heart failure, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, or stroke. A meta-analysis linked chronically short sleep to a 45% jump in coronary heart disease risk. And in 2022, the American Heart Association elevated sleep duration to the 8th pillar of its cardiovascular health framework, placing it on the same level as diet, exercise, and blood pressure. A major analysis spanning 72 studies and more than 50,000 participants found that sleep disturbance drives up C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, markers of chronic inflammation that bridge cardiovascular and cognitive decline. Insomnia roughly doubles the risk of developing depression, which creates yet another feedback loop that deepens sleep difficulty over time. Falls deserve their own mention for anyone taking sleep medications. Nursing home residents using non-benzodiazepine hypnotics carried 1.66 times the odds of hip fracture in research published in JAMA Internal Medicine, with new users facing 2.2 times the odds. A separate meta-analysis tied Z drugs to a fracture risk increase of 1.63, and zolpidem use approximately doubled hip fracture risk in older adults in yet another study. All of which leads to the question that matters most. What can you actually do about this? The evidence points to a clear order of priority, and the most effective step is not a pill. Screening for treatable contributors comes first. Sleep apnea, nocturia, depression, and medication timing all deserve evaluation. A simple tool called the Stop Bang questionnaire catches moderate obstructive sleep apnea with 93% sensitivity at a score of 3 or higher. If you or your bed partner notice loud snoring, gasping, or pauses in breathing, that warrants a conversation with your doctor. The same applies if you physically act out your dreams by kicking or vocalizing during sleep, a condition called REM sleep behavior disorder. Research on that condition found that nearly 35% of people with it developed a defined neurodegenerative disease within 5 years, and that number climbed past 92% at 14 years. That is not meant to alarm you, but your doctor needs to know. The single most effective treatment for insomnia in older adults is a structured behavioral approach called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. A meta-analysis of 20 randomized controlled trials published in Annals of Internal Medicine showed that CBTI cut the time to fall asleep by 19 minutes, trimmed nighttime wake time by 26 minutes, and lifted sleep efficiency by nearly 10%. A 2022 meta-analysis focused specifically on older adults found wake time reduced by over 23 minutes and sleep efficiency improved by more than 8% with zero adverse events. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine gives CBTI a strong recommendation as first-line treatment for chronic insomnia. Dr. Michael Irwin at UCLA demonstrated that CBTI lowers inflammatory markers in older adults. What separates CBTI from every medication on the market is durability. The gains last after treatment ends. Bright light therapy ranks next, but timing matters more than intensity for this population. Because the core problem in older adults is a circadian rhythm that has drifted too early, evening light exposure is the right move rather than morning light. Late afternoon or early evening exposure to bright light pushes the circadian clock later, delaying both the temperature nadir and the cortisol surge. One study found that evening bright light reduced nighttime wakefulness by approximately 1 hour after just 12 days. Standard therapeutic dose sits at 10,000 lux. Exercise is the third pillar, and the bar is lower than you might expect. A 2025 meta-analysis covering 50 studies found that exercise raised sleep efficiency by over 3.5%. The strongest gains came from sessions of 30 minutes or less, at low intensity, performed just twice per week. Napping needs careful handling. Naps of 30 minutes or less in the early afternoon appear safe, but research found that each additional hour of daytime napping raised mortality risk by about 13%. A separate study tied napping more than 1 hour per day to 1.4 times the risk of Alzheimer's dementia. If medication becomes necessary, the evidence clearly favors newer options. The 2023 American Geriatric Society, Beers criteria, recommends avoiding all benzodiazepines and all Z drugs in adults 65 and older. When medication is truly warranted, dual orexin receptor antagonists represent a safer class. These medications work by blocking orexin, the wakefulness-promoting neurotransmitter, rather than broadly sedating the brain. A 2024 meta-analysis of 10 studies covering over 46,000 patients found no measurable increase in falls or fractures with these newer medications. Before we close, there is one more piece of this story. Dr. Roger E. Kirch documented that before the industrial age, Western Europeans did not sleep in one solid block. They slept in two phases called first sleep and second sleep, separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness known as the watch. People used that interval to pray, talk, or reflect before drifting back to sleep. Consolidated 8-hour sleep became the expectation only in the late 17th century. If you are lying awake at 3 in the morning, consider the possibility that this is not a disorder. It may be a remembered echo of history. Understanding why it happens is the first step towards sleeping through it. Try CBTI before reaching for a pill. Practice good sleep hygiene. Get bright light at the right time. Move your body. And if you do wake at 3 in the morning, remember that you are not broken. If you found this helpful, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who could benefit from it. We will see you in the next one.